The Shadow's a more promising movie than it is a successful movie, because there are moments in this that really are awesome, that are great. And there's so many pieces to the puzzle that are right up there on the screen that never connect together. Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision.
GenreVision is a weekly movie club where we discuss horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more.
And we continue Superhero Month with actually a pulp hero, with The Shadow, directed by Russell McKay, obviously adapted from the character that, I will admit that I don't have the deepest lore understanding of The Shadow, but what I know is that it started off as basically a narrator character on a radio show that then evolved into his own character because of popularity. And this is part of that really interesting period post Batman 89, where all the studios decided to dredge up the rights to all these pulp characters. Instead of making superhero movies, they made pulp hero movies. And certainly, The Shadow has superpowers in this version. And this has always been looked at as a pretty failed film. Alec Baldwin starring in the title role as the titular Shadow, Lamont Cranston.
Hell of a name.
A great name. A very, very classically, comic book pulp hero kind of name.
Have you ever listened to the radio dramas?
When I was extremely young, because my dad was like, oh, The Shadow, yeah. Because he grew up on all that kind of stuff.
I've heard bits and pieces of them on a vintage radio play hour or internet radio, loads of time ago. It's not something that ever really clicked with me, although I never really gave it a huge chance. But I'd be curious to look at it now, particularly after we've seen this movie, because it of course was very important during the time. There's a kind of a throwaway line later in this movie where they're talking about The Shadow as sort of like a news sensation, and a character says they only talk about The Shadow to get people to listen to the radio.
I looked up, there are a lot of nods to the radio show and the character and stuff like that are clearly there for deep embedded fans. Stuff that we did not pick up on because we are not deep embedded fans of The Shadow.
Yeah.
But this is universal. What's fascinating to me is we did Darkman earlier this year, fairly recently. And that was a Universal picture and stemmed from Sam Raimi trying to get the rights to The Shadow and not being able to for various reasons. So he pretty much just threw up his arms and said, well, screw it, I'm going to make my own, with blackjack and hookers.
Right. And it ended up not really being a Shadow movie. It borrows some of the same classic images and sounds, but it ends up being more of a tragic Universal monster film.
Sure. And go listen to our Darkman episode. But then Universal, just a few years later, made The Shadow. The movie they made is very clearly depending on the kind of stuff that was going on in Batman, and particularly this pulp movement of The Rocketeer and Dick Tracy. All these things were very much riffing on similar visual ideas and substances and stuff.
Sure. And the studios were willing to throw a lot of money at them. These were lavish productions.
Well, especially when Batman broke records and became the biggest movie in years. It's very hard to actually quantify, especially in this day and age, just how fucking prolific Batman 89 was in pop culture. It was inescapable,
ubiquitous. You couldn't get away from it. Yeah.
It makes sense that with all those kind of things that movie studios wanted to try and find their own cash cow. And The Shadow is an interesting one because while there are certainly, there's source material to draw upon, I think it's kind of tough to do this kind of character when you're also trying to make a 4-quadrant giant blockbuster movie, because The Shadow and his origins come from, I think, a horror background, and certainly like horror pulp and stuff.
Suspense, it's definitely sort of a suspense show. And what's really important is that although I think there had been visual representations of the Shadow in other media.
Yeah, there were comic books.
Yes, he was not most successful as a visual character. He was a presence on the radio. It was a vocal performance. And really, as a representation, visually, it was more like, oh, it's just this silhouette of a man that is an urban hero, a sort of modern myth. And the way that Russell Mulcahy decided to bring that to the screen comes with a whole lot of interesting choices, some of which don't work. Other ones do work, and then other ones are like, oh, that was cool. I understand the intention, but it's intermittently working.
I do think it's fair to put up front that the beginning of this movie, I think immediately both you and I were like, something smells funny.
Yeah, it's been messed with. Yeah.
Yes, because it starts with Alec Baldwin being this opium crime lord who murders James Hong, and is then eventually taken in.
Not in the city, by the way. He's where, in Tibet?
Sure.
It's basically the Far East. It is definitely a colonial idea of what the Far East is, because Lamont Cranston is a colonizer in a lot of ways. He's this white guy who arrived in the Far East. And I'm not saying that with any degree of sincerity.
Well, I mean, I do want to acknowledge that a lot of these pulp characters that they adapted, they have, and I don't know if this is true for the Shadow, but they have a lot of these origins in of Orientalism, and
sure,
this idea of like, oh yes, this is where you can get mystical powers and superhuman abilities because it's from the Far East, capital F, capital E.
Yeah, he went to the Orient to study, such and such.
Yeah.
Doctor Strange, Batman. So many of these classic genre fiction characters did this whole like I spent time in the Orient bullshit.
There's tons of them, and so that is here in this version. But what's weird about the opening is like, okay, I could accept this as the real opening of the movie until very quickly the movie fades to black and we get text scrolling on the screen.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. When a movie opens like that, not damnable. Star Wars did it, and there have been plenty of movies that have done it before. But
Blade Runner, its sequel.
Yeah, Blade Runner 2049. It's not an immediate indicator of like, oh, well, we feel the need to introduce the audience properly into a very complicated world. The best way to do that is just to have them read this text. But the fact that happens after the movie has started proper is weird.
Yeah, there's this weird prologue that exists with so little context. And then to essentially jam its thumb on the fast forward button and throw a wall of text at us to explain like Lamont Cranston went from being a rug-chested, long fingernailed, like Trent Reznor lookalike to being this pulp hero back in New York City. And the wall of text it gives us to explain that is like, whoa, you're fucking me on something. Like what's going on here?
It immediately made us suspicious of the movie. And it's like, this feels that it has been manipulated with in a way that does not work.
Yeah.
Because then we get, New York City 7 years later. And we get what feels like the opening of the movie, in which some gangsters have got a guy in literal cement shoes, which I don't even know if I've ever seen in live action. So it was kind of fun to see that extremely cheesy trope brought to life. And they're going to dump him off this bridge. And then the Shadow shows up and starts doing shadow shit. He's laughing and calling people out and I don't know, Invisibo, like punching people.
Invisibo?
Yeah, that was the word that came out because it sounded silly and comic booky.
It sounds like the way a 7-year-old would say, he turned invisible.
He's invisible. It's the Invisibo Man.
He does look like sort of a warpy, like man blob shape sometimes with like two floating fists. And, like a lot of ideas in the movie that's like, yeah, that's interesting, but at the time, I don't know if they had the technology to really do it well. Like it just doesn't come off like anything but goofy. And I'm okay with goofy, but I'm like, I don't know if you're really setting the tone the way you think you are.
Well, to make another comparison to Batman, this is the opening to Batman. Like,
sure.
This is, here's this very iconic classic scene of criminals doing stuff, and the dark hero shows up and is mysterious and, has to say his name. It's right out of the Batman playbook. The weird decision, because one of the only things that I ever knew about the Shadow growing up was like, oh, he's got 2 big fucking guns.
Sure.
Like, and in this, he doesn't use his guns except to shoot off the cement blocks of the scientists that he's saving. Yeah. I was like, he's got 2 big fucking guns. Like, why is he invisiboing? Like, shoot these guys. Like, but I understand, it's like, okay, there's probably some, studio note about like, well, he can't be shooting a bunch of people all the time because some, the LA riots happened or something happened.
I'm the gun murderer.
Yeah. Well, there's times when gun murder man is acceptable. And then other times when the studio or the ratings board is like, no, we can't gun murder like that right now. Yeah. So that's just a weird thing. Obviously the thing that we have to talk about is the decision to try and replicate the comic book look of the Shadow to the point where his face, which ostensibly is his mask because he has like a piece of red fabric over his mouth, and in the classic illustrations, a giant schnoz.
Yeah, this very angular, almost like a Marv from Sin City, almost like a Frank Miller silhouette, really. And instead of just trying to say like, well, it's, a pulp hero character, he disguises his identity in a way that's like kind of silly. But nobody ever knows the difference, even though you can see his fucking face. Like, they don't do that here. Instead, they go for something much weirder. And that this whole like angular face that he puts on, this really ugly makeup, is an illusion. It's magical. And he makes other people see it through his skills he learned in the Far East.
I understand wanting to go for that look because that's the look of the like the part of me that loves trying to pay tribute to the extreme designs of comic book characters likes that in theory. In execution, it does not work. It does not ever look right. Yeah,
comic book heroes on screen, it's a difficult thing because we want to see the face of the performer, right? That's why we hired Tobey Maguire and Idris Elba and any other prominent actor we use to play a masked character. There were a lot of problems with that early on where it's like, okay, if it's a costume where the character's entire face is supposed to be covered, people aren't going to sense the performance there. And indeed, like if you watch the Raimi Spider-Man movies, there are plenty of scenes where you're just like, yeah, that's a stunt guy. But there are issues where filmmakers and studio executives have largely been reluctant to have a star's face be masked for an entire production. And so here, I think there are some clever ways to try to get around that, to say like, it's, there is a face visible and we can still do what is recognizable from the comics. And it's not just going to look like Alec Baldwin the whole time. Like it's trying to have its cake and eat it too, a little bit. Like it seems like a really odd solution.
Except that it's mostly just Alec Baldwin all the time. And there is a part of me that wants to believe that is ego-driven on the part of the star. Like, you talk about Tobey Maguire and Spider-Man. Tobey Maguire had, I think, kind of the benefit of not being a star at that point. So it was okay to cover up his whole face.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't something that people were like, man, I'm missing Tobey Maguire's mug this whole time.
Sure. But I mean, there is a fair amount of time in this movie, in the first half, I would say, where there isn't a whole lot of the Shadow. It's a whole lot of Lamont Cranston as Alec Baldwin being like a detective socialite. And that's an interesting spin on the character. I don't mind that interpretation of it, but it does go for a pretty long stretch where you're like, there's not a whole lot of shadowing happening.
Well, and there's one of my favorite decisions in the movie is to give him these extremely reflective, weird, big-ass contacts when he goes into shadow mode.
That's great. And not only do they give him the context, but they light his face in very specific ways where sometimes they'll like go really simple with it, where it's just the bar of light across the eyes. And I'm like, that's awesome. It's such a beautiful formalist touch.
Oh yeah. And well, his whole voice and demeanor changes, and It's great. I love every moment where they decide to switch him over to those contacts and do that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, I don't need him in the cape and hat when he's doing that kind of stuff, because it's like, okay, the Shadow's here.
Yeah. Where, he learns, he basically does like Jedi mind trick stuff. He's able to tell people what, he wants them to say, and they'll believe it. There's this scene early on between him and his uncle, who's played by Jonathan Winters, and he's the chief of police, I think.
Yeah, he's the police commissioner.
Yeah, commissioner. Looking just like he ate Paul Sorvino is what you said, and you had basically stolen a thought from my brain. Or at least that's what it felt like, because I was like, Paul Sorvino much? And then as soon as you put that on, in our chat, I was like, God damn it, Deech reading my thoughts.
Yeah, this is drift compatible. Yeah. So, no, I mean, well, when we were watching this, I was like, man, I forgot the cast in this movie. It's like Jonathan Winters, Penelope Ann Miller, Tim Curry, Ian McKellen.
Yes.
Ian McKellen's in this. I'm like, Ian McKellen's in this?
Yep, briefly and with an American accent.
He's not. I mean, he's in it a bit, but he's very downplayed as a character. And like, so this first half, I definitely, when we were watching the first half, we're like, man, there's not a lot of Shadow, and this is kind of boring. It's really taking its time setting stuff up, and not in the most exciting of ways. Was when we doubled back on our like, something fucky happened with the beginning of this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have this whole bit of Lamont Cranston being an opium crime lord, and then there is one flashback in the movie to him like on a battlefield, like, I don't know, with blood all over his mouth, looking crazy. And I'm like, they did not spend the money to shoot those couple of things. And then just, clearly they took a lot of that out of the movie. I would not be surprised to find out that there's a big chunk of that stuff in the movie, because we are told about his training to become the Shadow. We see none of it. And it's that feels like, if you're telling me you didn't shoot that and you didn't write that, David Koepp is the credited screenwriter on this,
the only credited screenwriter.
Yeah, which is bullshit, like, clearly. But like he's the one that won arbitration. If you did not write that, that is terrible. So it leads me to believe that you did write that, and you all probably shot more of that, and it ended up getting pulled out because they wanted to get to the Shadow stuff. Or my real thought is it was reordered.
Yeah, it could very well have been reordered in the editing room, or, they could have rewritten the movie sort of halfway through production. Evidently, there was an earthquake that disrupted production on this and several other films in Hollywood at the time, destroyed certain sets on this film, and they had to kind of reconfigure things to no longer involve those destroyed sets, which is unfortunate. But like the main arc for Lamont Cranston in this film is him being able to reckon with his like drug lord past. And it bears mentioning here, and maybe more than a mention, that this whole arc of him adopting this, Tibetan drug lord, opium lord persona or whatever it is incredibly racist.
Oh yeah, I mean, that goes without saying, but we'll say it.
And the movie isn't reckoning with that at all. This wasn't made in a time where it was common for Hollywood films to really reckon with that stuff. Instead, what the movie does is it tries to draw this parallel between Lamont and his villain in the film, which is the descendant, the current, I think, last descendant of Genghis Khan.
Yeah, Shiwan Khan, played by John Lone,
who shows up in a museum in his great grandfather's sarcophagus.
Yeah, shows up and ends up making the guy from Critters. Most people probably know him as Neelix from Star Trek Voyager. Kill himself. Shiwan Khan, conceptually, and I think even sometimes from a performance standpoint, one of the highlights of the movie.
Yeah, I think he does what he's asked to do with a lot of aplomb. It reminded me a lot of the Shredder performance from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie we watched earlier this year, which had a great performance in it and was shot well. Like, they do some similar kind of shots with Khan in this film, where it's like, okay, here's a long crane shot, this big oneer that's going to introduce you to like how bad this villain is and like how cool they look in their lair, and here are all their hench people. It's like, okay, the visual language of that works. And the way that these two characters, Khan and Cranston, meet up is accomplished really early in the film, and I actually think in a pretty clever way. When Lamont Cranston goes to his sort of bat cave, the sanctum in the city, Khan's just there, just chilling,
Awesome.
and the villain's just already there. And I like that little note of subversion in the film where it's like, we're not going to take a more typical structure with this. Like, the villain's already here. And I think they do a lot of clever writing in talking about how these two characters are not so different, you and I. They never ever have to explicitly state, you and I are not so different. We know they're similar because they talk about these similar experiences they've had. They talk about the ways in which they're similar, but they never hang, or they at least never point a light at this idea that you and I are the same in many ways.
Well, and I think
it's written, I think, a bit more delicately than a lot of films would have handled it.
Well, I think another part of that delicate nature is in the performances. I like that Baldwin and Lone are really casual with each other.
Yeah. Oh yeah. They're just shooting the shit.
Yeah, they're extremely casual in a really kind of cool way. Like, it's something that we expect to see, I think, from a lot of good guy, bad guy. It's something, like James Bond and whatever Javier Bardem's character was,
Silva.
Yeah, like it's got that same kind of vibe. But I like here that there is a real on the same wavelength thing going on with their characters, and the way that that they'll share scotch together, or Shiwan Khan will point out it's a nice tie, and then the next time they meet, he's went to the place that
Brooks Brothers,
Brothers, that Lamont recommended. He's like, Brooks Brothers is a great tailor. I'll tell you. It's like, I like that. It's like, this is interesting. This is weird, and again implies a darker nature to our hero without ever having to say we're not so different, you and I.
Right. And I do like that the movie at least recognizes in those moments that Lamont Cranston could easily, just as easily, have been the big bad in this movie, because they've done so much in the same. There's a flashback sequence later on where we actually do get to see, like you said, like he's riding around on horseback and crazy, and mouth full of blood and bared teeth and this kind of stuff. He has committed atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and yet he is now the hero. And I think to gloss over that transition from this awful warlord to being the hero of the city is it feels especially clunky to do it with that text transition. But for the primary arc to be so underserved by the end of the film is one of my bigger issues with it. Let's talk a little bit about Penelope Ann Miller, because she gets a pretty significant turn at the center point of the film.
She does. She is hypnotized by Shiwan Khan to go and kill the Shadow, which she just goes to Lamont Cranston and knows that it's him, because earlier it's set up that she has some kind of telepathy with him. She can read his thoughts.
She's strong in the Force too. Yeah.
Right. If the Shadow has the ability to cloud men's minds, he cannot cloud this woman's mind, and to the point where he's an open book to her. The role that she's playing, I think Penelope Ann Miller is playing it just right, but it's sadly a very underwritten role.
Yeah, she's giving off, like, I don't know, Naomi Watts light in this movie. It kind of seems like a role Naomi Watts would have played 15 years ago, when she wasn't like the very well-known and accomplished actress she is today.
Yeah, I mean, and the biggest thing, obviously, from a romantic perspective, is that I don't think the romance is written very well. It's not just about functional, but you made a good point where this is the kind of screen romance where it feels like they're trying to hang their hopes on the pure chemistry between the leads, and the chemistry that's there is just okay.
Exactly. There are the scenes early on of them are not bad when, like, Lamont Cranston meets her in that one really swanky club, which comes out of like so many swanky pulp club scenes from those movies. There's just so many of them. It's somewhere in the Dick Tracy verse, but
The Mask.
Exactly. He suggests they go get Peking duck somewhere. So they sneak off to some smaller Chinese restaurant, and they have their first like one-on-one sort of bonding scene, really developing a dynamic. And they spend this sort of magical night together where they have to part, and she thinks she may never see him again, and she's a little forlorn about this. And it's like, well, I understand what the movie's trying to do, but it's also using a lot of cinematic shorthand to get us there.
Well, it's also boring.
Well, not really. Yeah, it is boring, but just don't feel it. You know what I mean? Don't feel it between the two of them.
It's boring because the whole reason that they're keeping them apart is Lamont's like, no, I can't get romantically involved because it's dangerous. When he's in the cab with his cabbie, Peter Boyle, who's his Alfred.
Peter Boyle, probably my favorite character in the movie, by the way.
He's like, it's dangerous for who, boss? And it's like, for me, because I'm dark and tortured.
I'm Alec Baldwin with my kissy face, my permanent kissy face in this movie.
Well, here's a point that I wanted to make that's a grand point. I think there's a little bit of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole with this movie because the character is so steeped in a lot of horror ideas, and it feels like they tried to shave off a lot of those. And that's unfortunate because when horror happens in this movie, it's some of the best shit in the movie.
Agreed. Yeah, Mulcahy is well-versed in horror at this point in his career. He's also pretty well-versed in like genre film action cinema on a budget. Like he made Highlander, which is Highlander rocks butts, dude. That movie's so good.
Listen to our Highlander episode.
Princes of the Universe.
There's a moment where after Margot Lane, Penelope Ann Miller's character, and Lamont Cranston get together and she's staying in his swanky mansion. He has a dream where he's sitting in front of a mirror and starts picking at his face, and he ends up pushing his hand underneath the skin of his face and ripping his face off,
dude,
to reveal that he's Shiwan Khan.
It's the best scene in the film by default because it's a really great amalgamation of good performance, good technique going on behind the camera, like good effects, excellent tone. Jerry Goldsmith's score in the movie is pretty damn good.
Yeah, it's a good theme.
Yeah, and everything that works around that theme is also pretty darn good as well. It's Elfman-esque for sure. You're definitely going to recognize some Elfman-y vibes going on in the film, and that whole scene of him, putting his fingers underneath his skin and stretching the skin, and there's something that passes over the lens. I forget what it is to wipe the frame. And then he rips his face off to reveal Shiwan Khan underneath. And I'm like, this is really what gets me excited. Like it's such a well executed moment. There are a couple of dream sequences in the movie actually, and they're all pretty good. Like the most interesting stuff I think in the film from a character standpoint.
I think while certain effects have not aged terribly well, I think the conceptualization behind so many of the effects moments in this movie are great. There's a point where the Shadow has to fight a bunch of thugs and they pin his shadow up against the wall. So he has to come out of the shadow, like to form himself.
I love that shot. That is a really brilliantly conceived shot. And I think it's just as well executed. For 1994, they pull that shit off.
Oh, and there's more of that, later when there's a lot of moments where they just have a straight up cartoon shadow silhouette, flying around places. And I love that shit. Like, it's like, man, yes, like towards the end of the movie, there's this great, almost like the opening credits of Tales from the Crypt shot where it's just flying through this mansion and we're seeing the shadow flying around until it gets to the top of the stairs. And there's the Shadow in the big fucking hero shot of the movie with his cape billowing behind him for no reason other than it looks
CGI
awesome.
Cape. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but it's
again, for 94, I think it works fine. CGI capes have definitely gotten better in the years since then.
Well, no heroes wear capes anymore. So,
that's not true.
Not in the MCU. They aren't too crazy about capes.
No capes.
Yeah. That's I think part of the reason why we don't see capes anymore is because of the Incredibles. I think conceptually the movie hits a lot of great moments. There's a great conceptual idea of introducing Shiwan Khan in his throne room lair, where it's this giant big crane shot from above where he's in these robes that blend into the floor and then he raises up and we see that it's him. And then continuing the shot, Mulcahy just keeps spinning around this room. You were saying when we were watching it in the first half, it was like, man, this is like the most reserved Mulcahy movie that we've seen and certainly done for the show.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, I think there's a reason for that, because the further we got into the movie, it was like, there's our boy Russell. There's our boy Russell. Like, just more and more, there were these big sweeping, shots that are very evocative of the kind of stuff we see in Highlander. There was more interest in taking a weird visual concept and integrating it into the camera's movement. Like, just to be straight up front with y'all, the first half of the movie, we were like, man, I don't think this is working at all. Like, this is a bummer.
There are things about it that work, but like halfway through the movie, this movie takes, I don't know, the right pills, and hits exactly the notes it's supposed to, I think, to work in its most basic functions. Like, there is a scene like right after the dream scene, or I think it starts really with that dream scene where he rips his face off, because the next morning, Lamont Cranston and Penelope Ann Miller's character, I can't remember her name, sorry.
Margot Lane, supposedly
thank you.
Lois Lane.
There is a totally different dynamic between the two of them. The dynamic between the two of them is reinvented essentially at this point in the film, which makes me wonder if it was rewritten.
Yeah, it's snappy.
They suddenly have a bickering sort of Hawksian back and forth, like, you tried to kill me, da 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 da. And the movie is suddenly on like crazy energy. And I was like, where was this? It's a really jarring switch, because it stands in such stark contrast to the relatively like I said, like a really reserved pacing of the first half of the film. But damn, that injection of energy is really welcome.
Yeah, I mean, the second half, I don't know if it's technically true, but it feels this way. The edit and pacing just feels snappier. Like, things feel like they move at a better pace. The momentum, the set pieces are more interesting and fun. There's more fun visual ideas being executed. Like one of my favorite shots is when it's revealed that Shiwan Khan has hypnotized the entire city into forgetting that there's this giant hotel in the middle of New York, and that's where his base of operations is.
That's such a fun idea. Like the invisible building that everybody was hypnotized to forget. Love it. Stupid, but like great.
Wonderful. Yeah. Comic books can be stupid. Stupid is not bad.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is a great example of that. But in that, when they decide to, raid the hotel, there's two guards standing outside, and there's this great overhead shot of the rain and all these puddles, and then just invisible footprints running towards the guards to take them out. It's like, where the fuck was this? Like, it's so good. And there's tons of that stuff. I mean, like Tim Curry, who's introduced in the first half and then pretty much disappears for a big chunk of the movie, until he's brought back for plot reasons. Then it comes back. It's like, all right, Tim Curry's in this, and he's fucking Tim Curry.
Okay, so I would say like bottom tier Tim Curry that is still like appreciable as Tim Curry is like Home Alone 2, right? This is, I would say, several notches above Home Alone 2.
Where it goes, I think it gets into some top tier Tim Curry.
I don't know if it's top tier, but I think it manages to crank it up to mid tier Tim Curry, because the Shadow attacks him because his character's a fucking asshole who tries to kill him. And in the final moments of the character, Tim Curry's character loses his mind. I mean, succumbs to like full on madness and is like gibbering like a lunatic and drooling, and his eyes are rolling around. And I'm like, Tim Curry's really going for it here. Like,
I mean, that's
really
what,
earning that paycheck.
That's the thing, is like the majority of Tim Curry in this movie, lower level, maybe a couple notches above. But this final sequence where Tim Curry is trying to kill the Shadow and he is fucking losing it. I said to you, it's like, it looks like he's about to explode out of his skin. Like, there's this great overhead close up of him looking upwards basically into the camera, and he's just going like, coward. And it's just, it's awesome. And the Shadow drives him mad to the point where he makes him believe that there's an exit sign on this window, and he's like, there's your exit, whatever his name was. And Tim Curry,
dumb.
yeah, just Tim Curry giggling like a maniac is just like, just launches himself out of this fucking window and dies. It's easily one of the standout sequences of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, the third act where they start to ramp up the action eventually leads us to this confrontation between Lamont Cranston and Shiwan Khan that is, I think, pretty inventive, and it's clear that they had to kind of cut back on it. this Hall of Mirrors sequence was originally supposed to be something where Shiwan Khan was going to use the mirrors as like a metaphor to reflect Lamont Cranston's sordid past back at him. And I'm like, yeah, that's a smart idea. I can see why David Koepp might have gone for that. But it's also something I understand like why they might have cut. Evidently, this is one of the sequences that was affected by the earthquake.
Yes, the Northridge earthquake, unfortunately, they had to, I don't know if it specifically destroyed the sets or just messed up the scheduling. They ended up having to cut down severely on this finale, which it is. It's like the whole arc is supposed to be Lamont Cranston was an asshole and a bad guy, and the ending is him reckoning with, no, that's who I was. I'm the Shadow now. The Shadow's not a bad guy. The Shadow fights for goodness and all that stuff.
Which is frankly a little weak. I mean, for Penelope Ann Miller, for her character to go, it's in the past. Lady, he's going to have to answer for this shit that he's done. I mean, you know, this atonement is not transactional.
No, I mean, unfortunately, that theme is not heavily pushed for the character throughout the movie. There's so many moments where he's just like, I'm evil, that's why people got to stay away from me. Like, you know, you want to see, you're not going to like what you see, lady. Like that kind of stuff. And
with my kissy lips and my crazy eyes.
with my shiny contacts. And so thematically that does not work, and it's especially truncated by the ending, because the ending has visually it's very conceptually cool, and thematically it could have been cool, but it's just not there on the screen.
And the movie ends like so abruptly after that. There is a really cool violent gag where Shiwan Khan is dispatched by a flying shard of mirror, and it flies into his fucking forehead, and it's like, oh, whoa.
Yeah, it's
okay.
It's cool and violent, and then it's real. Then it's like, oh no, he's okay, and he's in an insane asylum, and they've done a lobotomy on him to remove the part of his brain that gives him his powers. It's revealed that the doctor who runs the asylum has one of the little, shadow club rings, which I don't know if that's from the actual material or if that feels like, it's like, hey kids on the radio, send away for your, shadow, code ring.
Exactly. I like the sort of acknowledgement of those kinds of props that instantly become toyetic, or that are designed to be toyetic, really, from their inception.
Yeah, I like that echoing.
I like that.
I think the movie clearly has the right kind of reverence for whatever source material there was, while still doing its own thing. There were moments in this movie where I was like, man, bring this shit back to Batman, where Lamont Cranston can walk down an alley and turn a dial on a pipe that then reveals a secret little staircase in the city. I'm like, oh, fucking yeah, cool. Or there's just some guy in the city whose job is to sit at a bunch of pneumatic tubes and wait for messages from the Shadow's agents to show up.
I love that.
That stuff is great.
It reminded me a little bit of that sequence where Ned Beatty is walking into the subway hideout in Superman the movie.
Right, yeah.
A little bit of that kind of fun stuff, Batman the animated series, the whole lair and hideout stuff. I love
just
that.
Classic comic book stuff that we just don't like anymore because it flaunts ideas of realism. It's like, no, this is good. Like, this is really fun stuff and adds a fun element to the world and the character. But yeah, so there's this ring that the Shadow gives, and it's like, all right, you're going to be agents of the Shadow now. So he's got all these agents all around the city, a police officer, and then eventually this guy that's lobotomized Shiwan Khan. And then the movie crossfades to Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane just kissing, and has the ending moment where he's got to walk away into the alleyway. Like, I gotta go be the Shadow. And it feels so cut. Like it feels like it's absolutely been manipulated.
That dissolved to them just kissing, and as the camera spins around them, I'm like, there is a scene that existed before this kiss. There is definitely a scene of dialogue where they're like having some sort of reunion and talking about things. Like, where is that? There needed to be something there. It's so just incredibly truncated. We were kind of left like, that's it. And then there's this really cheesy Jim Steinman song that comes on.
Oh yeah, Original Sin that tries to.
It's not a good Steinman song. Woof.
Yeah, kind of coming around to final thoughts about this.
I would love to see a longer cut of the film, just to see what was left on the cutting room floor and, what can kind of...
Yeah, release the Mulcahy cut.
Exactly. Release the Mulcahy cut. If such a thing exists, I would totally watch it. I don't know if it would necessarily make the film better, but I think just being able to fill out some of those moments that feel truncated would at least help the film for me. As it exists in its current form, I can't shake the feeling that it's not complete. It just doesn't feel whole. And that makes it hard to judge, like, as a film. Like, if it doesn't feel complete, it's like, well, what kind of grade do you put on it? It's incomplete.
It delivers in moments, but it never delivers in a big picture way. Like, it's never more than the sum of its parts. And that sucks because, like, those parts are cool. Like, there's really cool shit in this movie, but it feels like they all just got thrown into a blender. And this is the smoothie that came out. And it's unfortunate because I think there's a good movie in The Shadow, but we're never going to see it. And that's a bummer because the promise is all there on the screen. And sometimes it's executing it, but it never coalesces into anything that was more than those individual pieces. And it sucks.
Agreed.
Like, it sucks.
Magic threatens to happen several times in the film, and it never really quite does. Like, the film never really fully takes off. That is a shame, but I do appreciate, some of the pleasure that this was able to bring. Like, the silly flying knife with the crazy, creepy, toothed face on it.
Oh, that knife.
Is it a racist? Is it a race? Yeah, that one knife, what do they call it? The tulpa?
I don't remember what it's called. No, I think
whatever the fuck it is. It's a
the
very
Purba. That's what it was.
Yeah, there we go. The Furba, the Furby.
The Milmo, yeah.
It's a very funny idea, and it's goofily executed in a way that I liked seeing. And I like that it is eventually used as a bit of a character moment for Lamont. Like, you'll never learn to control the kooky toothed knife.
Yeah, it's the Luke Skywalker Empire Strikes Back. Like, there's always this obstacle that you were never able to get over. And then, by the time Return of the Jedi comes around, he gets over it. The highs of The Shadow are really high for me, but it's got some pretty deep valleys. It
definitely falls into some deeper crevices along the way, although it's never disastrous. Like, it never achieves like, oh, woof, this is a total disaster. I think some people would see it that way as, if you were to judge it by contemporary standards of like social awareness, like it's going to fail that test. There's no question. It is a kind of pulp fiction that is willingly indulging in the kind of exploitative, colonialist ideas, that white people have long had about Asian people and Asian culture. It, like I said, does not pass a sniff test on that kind of stuff these days. But I think in the right context, it's important to at least have that context when you're viewing the film. It's what makes Temple of Doom an exploitation film now. And it's not going to be my shelf pick, but I'm interested to see what kind of shelf picks you will have. The shelf here is a collaborative thing that we do on GenreVision. We every week will pull off a movie or sometimes something else off our shelf to recommend as a substitute or a pairing for this week's film. We welcome you all to do that as well. You have to do it at GenreVision.com. Go to GenreVision.com in your browser, find the post for this episode, and go to the comments section and tell us what your shelf pick for The Shadow would be. Drew, what are you pulling off the shelf for The Shadow?
I'm going to do another one from this era, and one that after revisiting The Shadow for the first time in a very, very long time, I can now say is better. This is The Phantom, starring Billy Zane. Joe Dante is a producer on this and probably secretly directed some of it. Who knows? The Phantom is great. It hits that sweet spot of pulp fun. It feels complete. Like, I don't think it comes across with the like, this has been futzed with. And it's another one that's like, we're going to embrace all the stuff about these pulp adventure stories, that we loved, for good and for ill. There will also be bad Asian stuff in The Phantom, but it's okay because Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa shows up in it. So it's like, hey, it's Cary. A really fun cast. Treat Williams is given a villain performance for the ages in that movie. He's so awesome in it. Just a real treat. I was one of the reasons I wanted to do The Shadow was because I have a love of these pulp characters and this era post Batman of making these kinds of movies. And I kind of want to, revisit them and see which ones work the best. And I think The Phantom's pretty up there now. So give that another rewatch. And as the poster said, slam evil. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for The Shadow?
I am pulling off a movie that kind of borrows some of the same pulp elements from the similar era. It feels like a movie that almost takes place in an adjacent building to The Shadow. This is The Hudsucker Proxy. There is a sequence in The Shadow where somebody puts a bit of information into a pneumatic tube, and it travels all throughout, and you see Russell Mulcahy's camera chasing this information through tubes, in and out of walls and, outside into the city. It's a pretty cool sequence. I really liked it. And it was like, oh, this reminds me of one of the things, or some of the things that I really loved about The Hudsucker Proxy. It's a Coen Brothers film that they wrote with Sam Raimi. It is a great movie, and it definitely has this sort of like similar Hawksian influences. Jennifer Jason Leigh plays kind of a Hawksian woman, kind of a Lois Lane type character in some ways. It is a very good movie, and it is definitely not a comic book or pulp hero movie, but it does take place in sort of a pulpy universe. And I think that idea of a pulpy universe is one of the things that works the best about The Shadow. Like, some of my favorite stuff in The Shadow is like the model city.
Oh, we didn't even talk about that stuff.
Well, that's why I'm talking about it right now. The model city and Jerry Goldsmith's score, like soaring over the model city. It's like, oh, that's really cool. I love that stuff. And that kind of stuff also works beautifully in The Hudsucker Proxy. The models in The Hudsucker Proxy that stuff's just fucking incredible.
Go listen to our Hudsucker Proxy episode. We did it. And yeah, we loved it. But now we have to go over to the listener shelf picks for last week's episode on The Suicide Squad. DT Grizzler went with Sorcerer, the William Friedkin remake of The Wages of Fear. Great movie. Both of them. Nick and I did The Wages of Fear as an episode. So go check that out. Mr. Milksteak had The Expendables 2, Super Troopers, and Shaun of the Dead. Nice mix there. Eric Fuchs had the novel Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. And as an anti-shelf pick, Army of the Dead, which we talked about. Pale Fire went with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. We haven't seen you in the comments for a while, Pale Fire. It was very nice seeing you again. JT went with one of your favorites, Top Secret. Conanzilla had Mystery Men, MacGruber, and Psycho. Nice. I like these mixtures of movies. And Moldy Wilson had Once Upon a Time in Mexico. And Stephen S. Bella went with the animated film Suicide Squad, Hell to Pay. Thanks, everybody. Also, nice seeing some names that we haven't seen in a while. Pale Fire, Conanzilla, Moldy Wilson. Always love seeing y'all and seeing y'all on the shelf. So, as always, thanks, everybody, for your shelf picks, and looking forward to the ones for The Shadow next week. Now we do have to do some quick calls to action, but stick around because we've got some new release one new release show and a new release movie. Fairly new release from this year that we're going to talk about. But
what is time?
Yeah.
Is time? Does time be and is? Find out.
But first, we have one of our favorite things to talk about on here. We have a new review on the Apple Podcast Store. This comes from Terry2099. And they say 5 stars, a really great movie review podcast. I stumbled upon the show a while back, and it was such a good find. There's some great and insightful conversations to be had here. Every episode I've listened to has been awesome. You're awesome, Terry2099.
Fuck yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the show. And Terry is a hero because they've left a review on the Apple Podcast Store. These things help us out so much. They are a genuine currency in the podcast market, and Terry has just it's just filled our pockets a little bit. So thank you so much, Terry. If you want to be cool like Terry, go to the Apple Podcast Store, leave us a rating and review, and if you leave a written review, we will feature it here on the show. And if you want more GenreVision goodies, go to patreon.com/GenreVision. You can become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. You'll get access to a ton of bonus material we do, like weekly pre-shows. We just did one that is pretty much an extended discussion about The Suicide Squad, a movie we love so much that we had to talk about it again and talk about some of the stuff we were not able to talk about or just, didn't find the time to in our regular episode. But there's also monthly extended currently consumings, bonus material for all the other GenreVision shows. You can get all that at patreon.com/GenreVision. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Well, when I reactivated my Disney Plus subscription to watch Loki, I also intended to watch Pixar's latest film, which is called Luca. And I mean, it's a sea monster movie. You and I like sea monster kind of stuff, and I think, it's well reviewed. I'll probably like it. It's a Pixar affair. So I know that there's a certain standard of quality for a Pixar film that's, an original property. It's like, okay, I'll take a shot on it. And it's, thankfully pretty good. It's small, it's unassuming. It's definitely not the kind of Pixar movie that's going to get a sequel. And I like that they employed sort of a different animation style for this film. It does not look like you think a Pixar film should. It almost looks a little bit like Aardman, like a Wallace and Gromit kind of thing. Not in the sense that it looks clay animated, but the character designs are kind of not Pixar standard. And I liked that a lot. I like that they were finding a new art style for it. I mean, it's a fairly simple kids movie, but it has more than its fair share of like really solid grace notes that make it resonate, with somebody who's a little bit older like myself. So I would recommend it to anybody. I mean, it's just a good all ages solid pick. If you got it on Disney Plus, there's no reason that I think you should skip it, and just watch, with yourself or your significant other, with your children, fine film. It's not going to win, I think, any huge awards or anything like that. But it's, it's a good time. It's a good time.
Well, another good time to be had this week was the premiere of Star Trek Lower Decks Season 2, a show that I was already over the moon with, and I even got you to watch, and you thoroughly enjoyed. I'm talking for you, but I know that's the case. The premiere was exactly what I wanted to be. It's like, yep, Lower Decks is still kicking it old school. This is the best Trek show since Deep Space Nine. It's by far the best Trek thing to happen with the property in forever. Mike McMahon, he's a true blue, dyed-in-the-wool Trek nerd, but in a way that it's like when we talk about John Waters, where John Waters talked about, I never made parodies of stuff I hated. Like, I only made parodies of stuff I loved. And you get that in Lower Decks, even in like the opening sequence in this, which is so great. The character of Beckett Mariner is running this very intense holodeck simulation. It's her workout program, but her workout program involves breaking out of Cardassian torture camps. And it's interrupted by this other crew member, this Andorian, who comes in and is like, yeah, the captain wants you in a ready room. And she says, it's like, your workout is to break out of Cardassian torture camps. And Beckett's like, yeah, what do you do? Yoga. And wow, so unique. And then the Andorian leaves, and Beckett says, I know we're not supposed to have interpersonal conflict, but I really hate that Andorian.
The whole last minute and a half of you trying to explain this joke to an unseasoned Trek watcher, and I'm not terribly well seasoned in Trek watcher, was like, and then he puts the Geflugelflorp in the Google Miser. I mean, the one thing about this show that I absolutely love, as somebody who isn't like richly like versed in Trek lore, is that Mike McMahon is not only clearly a source of like encyclopedic knowledge about Star Trek lore and like how like to pull jokes from it. He also hired an incredibly whip smart writer's room with just as much knowledge, and understands the fabric of Trek. It's not about the like random bits of trivia and Easter eggs that they pull from the lore. I think you and I can both agree, like, this understands Trek on such a deep level that it's able to repurpose so much about the series thematically, like from a character standpoint. I love season 1. I thought it was brilliant.
Oh yeah. I mean, season 2, McMahon has the sole writing credit for the premiere, and it's a great setup. I mean, I won't spoil any of the continuing story that's going on, but It gets that, hey, Trek is at its best when it's episodic because it's able to explore really targeted ideas in an episodic format, while there's still, character building and stuff going on. Even in Deep Space Nine, which everybody's like, oh, Deep Space Nine's so good because it's serialized. It's like, no, it's an episodic show, but they just really, like, every episode is building on the characters. That's what I love about Lower Decks, is that they can have their episodic Trek adventures, but in the next episode, they're not going to ignore what happened in the character growth that has gone on because of this wacky adventure they just had for one episode. And that's certainly true in the premiere. Like the B plot between Tendi and Rutherford is great, is so good. Building their relationship and everything. And most importantly, the show's fucking funny. Like, it's a really funny show, like you said, without having to necessarily always lean on Trek stuff. But that line when she says, I know we're not supposed to have interpersonal conflict, but I really hate that Andorian, is a nod to the fact that when Next Generation was being made, Gene Roddenberry had an edict of there will not be interpersonal conflict between characters.
Yeah, if there's beef, they squash it on that show, and they squash it quick and hard.
Yes, and a lot of writers were like, well, how the fuck are we supposed to do this? And eventually there was interpersonal conflict that they integrated into the show. But it's an acknowledgement of, like, yeah, we know this is a thing with Trek, and it's okay that we're breaking what was an established rule at some point. Like, it's not afraid to bend or break certain rules while still understanding what the heart of Trek is. Like, part of one of the main complaints about modern Trek is that it's so steeped in violent action, and not just violence. I mean, there is over the top gore violence in modern Trek, but more so that, oh, Star Trek is a bunch of ships flying around shooting lasers and blowing everything up.
Sure. And that kind of stuff is really, it can be really exciting when you're like watching it in cinemas, and like J.J. Abrams is, pushing all the bluster he can at you. But on TV, like Star Trek, I think has to be a more cerebral experience. Like, that's really what it's suited for, I think. And while Lower Decks is irreverent and sometimes just like flat out silly, and to a point where it's like, kind of a Justin Roiland show silly, it doesn't lose that Star Trek, cerebral aspect to it.
Well, Mike McMahon comes from, Rick and Morty, and then he also did Solar Opposites.
Yep.
With Justin Roiland. And so, yeah, it certainly has that vibe, but I think what sets it apart from those shows is the kind of heart that McMahon recognizes has to be at the core of Trek. Like, it has to be reaffirming. Like, that's something that I think so much of modern Trek has lost, is that Starfleet doesn't have to be perfect. The characters don't have to be perfect, but at the core, there has to be a reaffirmation of, like, but this is good. Like, there's good in all of this.
Yes.
Because the show Lower Decks does have big action stuff in the first season, and this season premiere has a giant action beat in which a giant head is floating in space and trying to basically eat the Cerritos. So I also think animation's great because it allows for the franchise to go back to its wackier roots. Like, people forget Star Trek was really fucking wacky, like not just in TOS, but in TNG as well. So the idea that it does not have to take itself seriously, it just has to love the material. That's something that kind of gets lost in a lot of modern interpretations of these properties, is that they believe that taking something serious means that you understand it and you get it and you care about it.
Right. Whereas, Lower Decks proves that you can be super irreverent and have still like done your homework.
Oh yeah. I mean, have a deep understanding of what's right about this franchise. And
yeah. Or like, what is like core philosophically defining about Star Trek? You can know umpteen gazillion bits of fucking trivia about which species lived on this planet and who did what in this episode. Ultimately, that kind of shit matters so much less than just understanding what the material is trying to do philosophically, or like what kind of archetypes belong in this sort of fiction. Like, just knowing the stuff inside out is clearly important to Lower Decks' success. Like, I am so looking forward to seeing the full season 2. I may hold off on watching this season until I can watch the whole thing from start to finish, because I did that with Lower Decks and it was like, oh my God, I can't stop watching.
Yeah, I'm glad to have it to look forward to every week. Like, it's something to look forward to every week now.
Awesome.
And I can't, like, if it's as good as the season 2 premiere was, then who buddy, we're off and running. But we will be back next week continuing Superhero Month with an American adaptation of a Japanese superhero. We're going to be watching The Guyver. This will be Travis's first viewing of The Guyver, and
the live action film The Guyver. This is I've seen little bits and pieces of it, but this is going to be my introductory watch here.
Yes, and I want to preemptively apologize to everyone next week. I am a enormous Guyver dork, and I am encyclopedic about Guyver lore. So I'm gonna probably say a whole bunch of bullshit next week, but I hope you'll be there to listen to me. This will be one of my few, if only, opportunities to geek out about a very niche property that I'm crazy about. So this will be very, very interesting. I hope you'll be back next week to check out The Guyver with us. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we will see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.